Thank you.
Okay. Oops. Thank you, Lori. I'm just going to throw my 2 cents in for Pat's work, because when I was on the board, I knew nothing about the League of Women Voters. I knew nothing. And there was plenty of people who helped me learn and journey through that process. So don't feel like you need to be an expert. Yes. And Dr. Johnson has said we should call him Ted. Yes? Okay. And we are recording this. Is that going to be okay with you? Okay, great. So I'm very honored to introduce him. He is the director of the Fellows Program at the Brennan Center, and we have accessed the Brennan Center on numerous occasions for wonderful presentations and assistance in the democracy. So he's going to speak to us about his book. If you haven't read it, it's When the Stars Begin to Fall, Overcoming Racism and Renewing the Promise of America. And so I'm really grateful to be able to hear him in person talk about his book that I've been reading, and help us understand our opportunities to renew the promise. Mm-hmm. And please take it away, Ted.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for being here this evening. How long do you want me to go? 15, 20, 30? What's the, before we go into questions and that sort of thing?
Usually the speaker talks no more than 30 minutes.
Okay, perfect.
We do allow an hour and a half for this meeting, so we try to really stick to that timeline. Mm-hmm. And we just want to make sure we have time for questions. So I would say no more than 30 minutes. If it's less, that's fine.
Perfect. Okay, excellent. So first, I want to thank you all for the work that you do. As you know, there are a lot of attacks on our democracy that have really been happening since the nation was founded, but some of these attacks have been renewed over the last decade plus. And so the work that you guys do in getting people educated, getting people registered, getting them to the polls on election day, all of that sort of thing, it is the engine of democracy. So, so thank you for that work. And so I figured what I do, the book is sort of, I call it a three-legged stool of three-legged stools, because there are 3 packages of 3 ideas that comprise the book. But instead of walking you through each of those, I figured I'd just tell you a story as a way of unpacking the general thesis of the book. But I want to tell you what that thesis is up front, and then we can talk a little bit about story, some of the lessons, and then and go into questions. So the first thing the book declares is that racism is an existential threat to America. All right, and everything is an existential threat to everything now. I hear that word so much now that it starts to lose meaning. But when I say it, what I'm saying is that structural racism is an existential threat to the American ideal. Okay, the principles upon which this nation was founded, principles which we've yet to live up to fully, but principles, again, that guide the direction of the country when we're at our best. So the idea here is, if the promise of America is essentially what's set forth in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, which says that we're all created equal. It says that we all have unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it says that government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. If that's the promise, there is nothing about the promise that is compatible with structural racism. And so either we begin to push structural racism back and overcome it, or the ideals upon which the nation was founded erode. The 2 things cannot coexist without one bruising, without one side giving. So this is what I mean when I say that racism is an existential threat to America. It is that we cannot become a more perfect union if we're unwilling to address the impacts that structural racism has on our country. The second part is, in order to overcome this structural racism and preserve our nation, and frankly, to improve it, we have to establish a national solidarity. National solidarity, as I define it in the book, is inherently multiracial, and it is when people across difference come together for a cause of morality or justice in order to compel the nation state to live up to its end of the social contract. Right now, when we live in a country that does not sufficiently address structural racism and the impacts that it has on all of us. When we don't address the inequalities that are produced, then we are basically letting the nation state off of the hook. They are in breach of the social contract. And what national solidarity is an instrument to compel the nation state to remain on good terms on the social contract instead of falling into breach. The third piece of this says that if we want to learn how to build this national solidarity, we can look to Black America as a kind of example of what the attributes of this solidarity could look like. The book doesn't claim, I don't claim that Black America exclusively holds the answers. I am saying that any group that has ever been marginalized in this country, that group's work, their energies, endeavors, their faith, their optimism that push the country to include them, that group has a lesson for how to create solidarity across difference. Suffragists taught us a lot about what it means to work your way into a democracy that you have been excluded from. And so suffragists have a lesson to teach America about democracy. Native Americans have lessons to teach America about democracy. White immigrants from Ireland and Italy and Poland have lessons when they were originally arrived and were excluded from citizenship. They have lessons to teach America about how to fulfill its promises. This book is about the Black experience. And I sort of pull that experience out and pair it with my family's story from slavery to the White House to show how the attributes of solidarity that I call out are actioned in the lives of people, try to put flesh and bone on these ideas, okay? So that's the theme of the book. Racism is a threat to America. National solidarity is the only way we can overcome this threat, and we can look to Black America to find some characteristics of what that solidarity should look like. Okay, so with that laid out, I want to tell you a story about this patch of highway in Northern Maryland, Route 40. Route 40 in Maryland, just as the interstate system was really being built, but even before then, it was the main thoroughfare from New York down to DC. It was the main stretch of highway that lots of cars drove before the interstate was here. So in 1961, there were a lot of new African nations that had just gained their independence from the empires that they were a part of before, whether it's Britain or France or these other places. They were gaining their independence in the late 50s and the early 60s. As they gained their independence, they named ambassadors who would come to the United States to sit in the UN in New York, and also to be the ambassador to the United States and come to DC, to the State Department, to the White House to present their credentials. So this stretch of highway in Northern Maryland, Route 40, a lot of these ambassadors would fly into New York and then drive down Route 40 to DC to present their credentials to the White House and have meetings with the State Department. Well, in 1961, this route of highway in Northern Maryland was segregated. And so as these African ambassadors are coming to the United States and they're pulling over on this highway to get coffee, to spend the night before coming into DC, to use the bathroom, they're being met with white diner owners who are telling them, oh, we don't serve Black people here. And this is foreign to them. They didn't grow up in Jim Crow, but the diner owners only saw the color of their skin. And because of Jim Crow in America and racial segregation, they would not serve these ambassadors. When one diner owner was asked by Life magazine why she didn't serve these African ambassadors who were on their way to meet the president, she replied, I couldn't tell he was an ambassador. He just looked like an average run-of-the-mill Negro to me. Instead of saying Negro, though, she used the other N word. So in their mind, they didn't serve Black people, and it didn't matter if you were down the road in Baltimore or if you were an ambassador on the way to meet President Kennedy. Once Kennedy, however, and the State Department got word that these new ambassadors were being slighted on American diners on this stretch of highway, they made appeals to the state government of Maryland to say, you are harming our national security interests by turning these ambassadors away. We are in a Cold War against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is telling the world that communism is the better way forward. We, the United States, are telling the world that democracy and liberty and equality is the better way forward. And Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as other places in Southeast Asia, et cetera, are the battleground for the Cold War. And so as we're competing with the Soviets on the world stage and fighting for influence in Africa, we are telling these African ambassadors, you can't get coffee here because of the color of your skin. And Kennedy and others told the governor of Maryland and the state assembly and the diner owners, you are hurting national security interests by doing so. After several months of this, the diner owners and the state of Maryland eventually agreed to desegregate this stretch of highway, but only for African ambassadors. So if you're an ambassador on your way to present your credentials and you pull over into one of these diners after this agreement's been made, you will be served. Oftentimes they put them in a separate room. So the truck drivers that frequent these places, mostly white men, wouldn't have to sit next, have the, suffer the indignity of sitting next to a Black person. So they would give them the special treatment and put them in these rooms in the back where they could be served and not offend their everyday customers. Well, when Black people who lived in this part of Maryland got word that these places have been desegregated, well, they started to go there too, and they were turned away. And this is the point that this is the reason I'm telling this story, is to make this point, that the interests of the nation, the United States national security interests, desegregated that stretch of highway, but only to the point that it would meet their national security interests. Serving Black Americans that lived in the area did not further our interest in the Cold War in this particular instance. And so they were not welcomed into these restaurants, and there was no Kennedy to show up and say, wait a minute, we mean all Black people. There was no State Department demanding that it be completely opened. Their interests had been satisfied and they walked away. Eventually, the entire stretch of highway, all of the places became desegregated some years later, in the middle of the 60s. But the fact that they were willing to desegregate to Africans first before their own fellow Americans, just because that was the only thing required to meet national security interests, suggests that the desegregation was not because they had been morally convicted that what they were doing was wrong. It was because it was in their interest to be responsive to the governor and the president of the United States, but only to a point. I'll wrap this part of the story up by saying a couple of newspapermen, Black men working at the Black newspaper in Baltimore, rented a limousine, they rented tuxedos, and they made up the name of an African country called Gabon. And they went to these diners saying, we are ambassadors with fake African accents from the land of Gabon, and we are here to just stop to get coffee, and they were served. And then after they did this a few times, they went back, but this time dressed as just plain old Americans, and they were told that they weren't welcome there and kicked out. And so another example that the desegregation that happened on the stretch of highway only extended as far as the interested. The point I want to make here is that the United States, like every other nation state in the world, is a geopolitical entity. It's not a moral being. And so nation states are not governed by an absolute moral compass or an absolute sense of right or wrong or an absolute sense of good or bad. Nation states are governed by their interests. The things that are good for nations are the things that are in their interests. The things that are bad for nations are the things that are against their interests. And those things can turn, things that were once bad can suddenly become good as soon as the interests flip. An example of this is when the nation was founded in 1776, or at least when we declared our independence, we decided to create the nation and to keep slavery in place. And so we are this nation founded on the idea that we're all created equal, and yet we enslaved people at the very same time. 90 years later, as the nation broke up during the Civil War, we went to war in a million casualties in order to abolish slavery and reunite the nation. So what was it about slavery in 1776 that made it okay to keep in place that was so horrible about it in 1860 that we had to fight a civil war in order to force the country back together and abolish slavery? Nothing got worse about slavery in those 90 years. And there was no wave of epiphanies happening across the men with power that suddenly convinced them that slavery was suddenly horrible. The difference was in 1776, it was in the interest of the country to create itself, declare its independence. And the only way that could happen, only way they could bring the Southern states in, was to allow slavery to stay in place. And in 1860, after the nation had broken up, the only way to bring the Union back together was to abolish slavery through war. And so the decision that slavery had to go was not a moral decision by a nation state. It was a decision made because it was in the interest of the state to do so. Okay, so if a nation is only governed by its interests, how in the world can we ever convince the nation that it's in its interest to start addressing racial inequality, to start being serious about getting rid of structural racism to the extent that we can? If we think that we can just make the moral case that inequality is wrong and that judging people by the color of their skin is wrong, and making the moral case is going to convince the state to take sweeping actions to eradicate structural racism, we're going to be wrong. We're almost 250 years old, and this country, and we've yet to really, really reckon with the role that racism plays in our nation. Certainly, we've made progress. I'm much happier being a Black man in 2021 than in 1921, or God forbid, 1821. So the story of America is a story of progress, but we've not sufficiently addressed the harms that are that centuries of bad policy have caused. And it's for this reason that many of the remnants of structural racism in our history are still with us today. So making the moral case alone is not going to be sufficient. What we have to do is show how the moral case for getting rid of racism or addressing racism is actually in the nation's interest to do. But the only way you and I can ever stand in solidarity together is not by showing how is not by appealing to our interests. And this is the difference between trying to form bonds of kinship with people and trying to compel the nation to do something. When you want to compel a nation state to take action, you have to appeal to its interests. But when you're trying to compel people to stand in solidarity with you, you can't say this is going to help you save taxes alone. You can't say this is going to make your school districts better, or this is going to save the environment alone. You can't appeal just to interests. You have to appeal to people on ideas, on ideals, on principles and values and morals. And so the moral causes that we stand for, those are the things that will keep us together when times are rough. Not the fact that we might save a few percentage points on our mortgage or on our tax rates, but we have to be to stand together in solidarity over a cause of morality or justice. So the way, as I see it, the way to combat racism is to bring people together over a cause of morality or justice, like equality, like these unalienable rights in our Declaration, like the idea that democracy means that government works for us and not the other way around, that government should be responsive to us, and that government should make it possible for us to give our consent by voting and by participating in our democracy. We come together for these things, but the way we move government is by appealing to the nation's interests. Maybe where I'll sort of wrap up here with two quick things. The first is to give an example of this framework I've laid out in real time to show how it's actually happened in our nation's history. And then I'll wrap up here with just telling you why I titled the book When the Stars Begin to Fall. So if we think about the greatest period of racial progress in our history since the Civil War, it's especially on the question of race, it's between 1948 and 1968. In 1948, we're coming out of World War II, and President Truman signs an executive order that desegregates the military and desegregates the federal workforce. 6 years later, the Supreme Court says in Brown v. Board that separate but equal is unconstitutional, and that desegregation, statutory desegregation statutory segregation, racial segregation is unconstitutional. 3 years later, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act. That same year, President Eisenhower sends the 101st Airborne to Little Rock High School in Arkansas to desegregate that so that 9 Black students can attend school there. He also sends the military, the National Guard, into the University of Mississippi to force desegregation there as they tried to hold James Meredith out from attending classes. In 1964, we get the Civil Rights Act. In 1965, we get the Voting Rights Act. And in 1968, we get the Fair Housing Act. 20 years of racial progress in the executive branch, and the judicial branch, and in the legislative branch. That wasn't because there was, again, a wave of epiphanies washing across white America saying maybe we're not treating Black people, justly here. It was because as I mentioned, we were in a Cold War, and every time we would show up and tell the world that democracy is the way forward, that freedom is the way forward, the Soviets would say, "And you lynch Negroes." As if to say, this freedom and democracy, I'm watching it play out on TV. I'm watching you sick German shepherds on civil rights marchers and hit them with fire hoses and beat them as they try to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge to register to vote, and having police beat them with batons. That doesn't look like freedom to me. That doesn't look like liberty to me. And if you're trying to sell the world that this is the future of governance, it doesn't look so appealing. And so now our interests were harmed because it made us look like hypocrites on the world stage. It made this land of the free, home of the brave, where we were beating our own people who only wanted to participate in democracy, and the Soviets were pointing this out. And so the way we were able to achieve these major victories in every major branch of government, in the three branches of government, wasn't because of a moral cause alone. It was because we were able to show how our moral demands align to the nation's interest. And the nation's interest was to show that democracy is actually a thing of value and worth protecting and available to all. Okay, so When the Stars Begin to Fall. This is actually the title of a Negro spiritual that enslaved Black people used to sing, as a sort of work song, or during the few times they were able to have service out in the woods before churches were really built for them. The song is ostensibly about the day of rapture in Christian theology, where sort of, the Son of God comes back and all the believers are sent to heaven, etc. But what the song was really about was emancipation. But they couldn't sing about their desire to be free because that was forbidden. And so they would cloak their desires for freedom, for emancipation, in the Christian theology that was acceptable for them to sing about on the plantation. And so this song that was supposed to be about the rapture was really a song about emancipation. And When the Stars Begin to Fall wasn't when the souls arise to heaven and a new world begins in heaven, but it was when the old ways fall away and a new world is created. And in this new world, this new country, that people who were formerly enslaved would be able to participate in our democracy and help lead our country to be this more perfect union. In this way, the book asks a question towards the end. The stars are falling. And so we have a question today, the same question has been presented to every generation that's come before us. Are we going to be the generation to help the stars fall further into place as we finally become the embodiment of a multiracial, egalitarian democracy that fulfills the promise of America? Or are the stars going to fall out of the sky as we prove that maybe we weren't up to the task, and maybe we were too interested in ourselves and our own groups to practice sacrifice and forbearance to extend the project and make it available to more people? Throughout the entirety of this book, I use lots of political science stories and historical vignettes I've shared with you. I talk about philosophy all the way back from Aristotle forward, but at every step of the way, I talk about my family's story in this country. As you know, my name is Theodore R. Johnson. The R stands for Roosevelt. My full name is Theodore Roosevelt Johnson III. So I am a Black man from North Carolina, who is named after a rich white Republican who was president over a century ago. And this is because when my grandfather was born, my great-grandparents were so moved by President Teddy Roosevelt's invitation to Booker T. Washington to have dinner at the White House. This was the first time a Black man had ever been invited to the White House to dine socially, that my great-grandparents and many other Black families named their children after presidents, and Teddy Roosevelt was one of the more popular ones. And so my grandfather was named not after Booker T. Washington, a Black man that much of the nation revered, but after the white president, as a claim on democracy, as a claim on our belonging in this country. To them, it didn't seem ridiculous that they would name their Black son in 1918 South Carolina, racially segregated, very violent Jim Crow enforcement there. It wasn't ridiculous to them that they would name their son after a former president. To them, it was very American. It was almost like civil disobedience, a claim on this country that no one could take away. And generations later, I'm a retired military officer, but one of my duty stations in the military was at the White House as a White House fellow during President Obama's first term. And I got to tell President Obama my story of my family's journey in America, to include where I got my name from. And the fact that when Booker T. Washington met Teddy Roosevelt, they met in the Blue Room and sort of walked into the East Room where they ate. And the first time I met President Obama, it was in the Blue Room of the White House. It was 110 years, almost to the date, when I met Obama in the Blue Room, from when the event that spurred my great-grandparents to name my grandfather the name I now carry occurred. So this is the story of America. It is not just the beauty and ugliness of our history. It is not just uncritical praise of the nation we hope to be, but it is the line that connects these two dots. It's a story of progress, a story of a nation that used to exclude the vast majority of its people from participation in our democracy, to one that's gotten much better at it, but still has a ways to go. The thing that's keeping us from becoming the union we hope to become is, in my estimation, racial inequality. And if we fix economic inequality, if we fix the range of problems that confront us, whether it's around health insurance or energy or whatever, and leave racial inequality unaddressed, we will not be able to attain the promise that's in our declaration. But if we are serious about confronting racism, that makes all the other wicked problems that we face surmountable. We are able to tackle them because the thing that has plagued us from day one has been the role that race has played in our politics, in our economy, in our society. So this is the task before us. I offer a few ideas for how we can manufacture the conditions to build a multiracial national solidarity. But the task is very, very difficult. And the project of America is to prove, we're sort of a proof of concept. Is it possible for a very large, powerful nation of over 330 million people that's extremely diverse to come together and create an egalitarian multiracial society where everyone is on a level playing field and endure? And no other nation has accomplished this. We are going to see if we're up to the task, and now is our time to leave our mark for posterity. And so maybe I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you so much. I can't see everyone on my screen, so the hands raised probably isn't going to work. If you want to put questions in the chat. What do you think, Lori?
Yeah, we have one question in the chat I can see. Holly, do you want to just unmute and ask your question, or do you want me to read it?
Sure. First of all, thank you. What a pleasure to have you here. I sort of feel like I don't want this to be out of left field, but my question was, how familiar are you with the New Poor People's Campaign? Because this is such a massive effort, and it kind of speaks to, I've been involved in it, and it started 4 years ago or even a little earlier. And the moment you started speaking, I was like, this is, like, again, about morality. Like, what is our moral principle here? And so I was just wondering what you think of that as a strategy, and also kind of that multicultural, like that we need to have everybody on the same page, working together rather than against each other.
Yeah, that's excellent. Look, Reverend Barber is an incredible human being, and what he's trying to do with the Poor People's Campaign is essentially put to action many of the things, some of the ideas in the book, but ideas that predate me and him, ideas that have been around really since like Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists, maybe even since Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. But it's the idea that in a nation like ours, the only way that you can really change the country is if you have a multiracial coalition fighting to do so. And this is why a lot of times when a multiracial coalition forms, one of the first things that people who hold power and don't want things to change, one of the first things they do is appeal to different segments of this coalition on racial lines. And so they will they'll make some concessions to one group and not to the other as a way to try to break the back of the coalition along racial lines, which deepens the racial divide, but allows those with power to hold on to it. So what Reverend Barber is doing is incredibly important. One, he's appealing based on a moral call to action on the issue of poverty. Poverty infects all of us. Every race, every ethnicity, every region of the country. It doesn't matter what language you speak, what religion you are, what your nation of origin is. Poverty touches some aspect of your whatever identity group you identify most with. So it's a national issue that touches everyone, or it touches every group. The other thing he's doing is focusing his efforts on the South. And the reason he's doing this is because the South has always been a sort of embodiment of the race problem this nation has. It's never been just contained to the South, but that's where it feels most entrenched because of our nation's history around the Civil War, slavery, et cetera. And so if he can bring a multiracial coalition to the South on a cause of economic justice and make moral demands that these states and the nation writ large begin to address the issue of poverty, then he can change the course of the country. And this is why I think what he's doing is putting multiracial solidarity into action. And it's just incredible to watch. One of the things that I love that Reverend, he's actually said two things that I carry with me all the time. The first thing is that Jim Crow didn't die in the 60s. He went to law school and he became James Crow Esquire, which is to say, whereas Jim Crow was able to use the N-word and use violence to keep people away from the voting booth and et cetera, James Crow Esquire just passes laws that do the exact same thing without using racial epithets and without using violence. Instead, they just pass laws or regulations or change the rules of the game so that it has the effect of excluding people who are indigent or excluding people who from certain communities of color, for example, but it's not as explicitly hateful as the previous version of Jim Crow. The second thing he said is that a budget is a moral document. And so when a nation, a city, a state decides how they're going to spend their money, they're telling you where their moral priorities are. And so if we decide to spend lots of money on war and no money on homelessness or no money on poverty or no money on the social safety net, we are exclaiming the thing that is most important to us. But the only thing I'll say before sort of we can go to the next question is that, as I was saying during sort of the lead up here, nations are governed by their interests, and it's in the interest of the country to defend itself when it's attacked. The country isn't quite sure why it's in their interest to eradicate poverty when those with the most political and economic power are doing just fine in a pandemic, doing just fine in the face of inflation, doing just fine as wages are stagnant or their health insurance isn't covering the cost of their healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. But when those who hold the power, who hold the reins of government, do not feel threatened, then even when the people demand action, they will not be responsive to that demand unless they see it in their interest to do so. So I think what Reverend Barber is doing is incredible. I think he's the movement he's building is a model for what a national solidarity movement could look like. And here's the hoping that he meets some success.
Can you dim the light? Can I speak? Could I speak?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yep, absolutely.
I want to talk about critical race theory. And what I find frightening is 2 states now have written executive orders that it can't be taught in the high schools. But it's not taught in high schools. It's a graduate level course that is very complex. But almost by saying we're not going to teach it in high school, we are going to stop knowledge about learning about systemic racial issues from it even spreading. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Critical race theory has become a catch-all phrase, which basically is being interpreted as we can't feel uncomfortable when talking about race in our history. Anything that makes us feel uncomfortable, anything that's critical of our founding or our founders, we don't want our kids learning about that because maybe they'll grow up and not love this country. As you mentioned, critical race theory is actually a legal framework taught in law schools and some graduate schools. It's not taught in second or third grade, but what the argument against it is that critical race theory teaches that structural racism exists and that some groups, like white Americans, benefit from the existence of structural racism, and other groups, like Black Americans, are at a detriment. It's detrimental to their life chances and opportunity. And that's the idea that one group is helped by the presence of racism and one group is hurt by it is something that the folks that are anti-CRT believes will sort of leak into the curriculum of K through 12. So much so that there was a bill presented in, I think it was Alabama, to get rid of Black History Month because it was centering Black people and not paying enough attention to white people's contributions to the country. And so it was that CRT stuff. There are lots of books that are now starting to be censured because of CRT. I think it was in Tennessee where they forbid the talking about Rosa Parks because that was considered to be CRT, because we're talking about a woman who was discriminated against and stood up against those who were discriminating against her. So here's what I think it's all about. It's actually, there's one big concept I think it's about, and then one sort of it's a macro level concept, but we feel it micro. And I'll talk about that latter one first. At the micro level, there is a sense that that talking about our history, where people are being victimized, whether it's Native Americans, Black Americans, immigrants from around the world, that talking about their experiences, their oppression, turns white Americans into the bad guy. And so if we're teaching history that makes white people the villain and makes people of color the victim, then white children will begin to think that this is in the logic. White children will be, the idea is that they will be taught that they're the bad guys, and they don't want that taught. And of course, that's not accurate, but the nuance isn't, oftentimes doesn't have a place in some of these trumped up politically manufactured debates. So there's that. The other part of this is that learning about our full history and not the mythology of it challenges our identity. In America, we are raised from, really from preschool, kindergarten on, that we were a nation who escaped tyrants in Great Britain and only wanted our religious freedoms and to govern ourselves. And we came to this new world and established a new country where democracy reigned supreme. And we created a superpower out of this new country because we believed in democracy and principles and freedom and liberty, et cetera, et cetera. And what the actual history of the United States shows is that many of our actions weren't principled at all. But if our American identity is connected to our mythology, and our actual history tells folks that our mythology is not true, or that it's sort of lies, it's a lie by omission, then who are we as a people? If we are not the freedom-loving people willing to create a beacon of light to the world about democracy, and instead we're just self-interested groups of folks that were looking to take land, make money, force people into labor in order to be prosperous, that's less of an identity to be proud about. So what CRT is really about, we're fighting about the story of America. That's what it all boils down to, and the place of each group in that story. In the mythology, one group comes out on top and the other groups are welcomed in, thanks to the nation's largesse and the grace and good nature of those that were on top. In reality, the people who were excluded battled our way into this democracy. And we want to tell the story of that battle, but those who are the beneficiaries of the old way of doing things, there is a cohort of folks there that don't want that story told. So in my view, that's what CRT is about, the story of our country and the identity that then results from that story. And we don't agree of the role of race in that story or the status of groups as a result of it.
One of the things I think is that people look at it as a one-on-one and they say, I'm not a racist, so why do we have to learn about that?
That's
and they don't
exactly
really
right.
understand. They don't understand systemic issues that affect racism. And, I'm getting up in the years and I'm still learning stuff. I didn't realize that Great Britain did away with slavery in the 1830s. And that's
Yes,
why the South kind of lost, because they cut off their supplies of, goods and grains and finance. So
yeah. So and
go ahead.
no, you're absolutely right. And so this is why, so you're right that as long as racism can be seen as just a problem of people's hearts, the way an interpersonal issue that that governs how people interact, then the public policy has nothing to do with it. And so, and this is why people resist the idea of structural racism, because structural racism can only be addressed by public policy and not by changing the neighbor of the heart of your neighbor. So in the book, I say that structural racism is a crime of the state. And what the idea here is that it is the government's responsibility to eradicate the country of racism. It is not up to me and you getting along better. It's not up to the one by one changing of hearts, which is important, but that's not how we eradicate racism. And what it also does by declaring racism to be a crime of the state is that it turns the bickering from the people to the state instead of from person to person. So racism is not a problem that Black people and white people need to figure out. Racism is a problem that the people must demand the state begin to make amends for and address through good public policy, like executive orders that desegregate things, like big acts from Congress that make voting more accessible to more people, like Supreme Court decisions that protect people's right to vote and protect people's civil rights. These are mechanisms and instruments of public policy that actually eradicate racism, structural racism anyway, in ways that you and your neighbor getting along after years of animus never could. So you're absolutely right that the more people can make racism seem to be a thing that we have to work out amongst one another and within our hearts, and less a thing that the government must do structurally through public policy to fix, then the more the nation is let off the hook, and the more we are weaponized, more our emotions are weaponized and turning us against one another and preventing us from creating any kind of solidarity.
And it's true, it's got to be done through education too. You can't block the teachers from talking about certain things. I understand they're starting to censor certain books like Roots, Midsummer's Night's Dreams, and things like that. There was a video I saw of a 15-year-old, and they were talking about Black Lives Matter. He wrote All Lives Matter. And the teacher said, you can't talk about that. And to me, I thought that was a learning moment for the teacher to explain the difference. But
I'm going to jump in here for just a second, Gary.
Yeah,
I'm
go
sorry
ahead.
to interrupt
I talk
you.
too much. Go ahead.
We never say too much, especially about eating. But there are other people who have questions, and I want to make sure that they have a chance. And sure, but then you really brought up very good information and a good topic to talk about. So Gail, you had a question. I'm not sure if it was answered, because it kind of was maybe, but do you want to say it or you want me to read it?
Well, I did want to just throw in here because Ted mentioned Tennessee, and I don't know if it was the same school district that is banning the book Mouse, which is the graphic novel about the Holocaust. And when a huge percentage of people are Holocaust deniers and don't believe it, it is just criminal that this is going on, and it's terrifying to me personally, and to my children. What I was really referring to in the question was going back to what you were talking about, which is probably a teaser about everybody really needs to read your book, and I will. And that's good. You need to be a marketer. That's good. That if you can talk a little bit more about those conditions that we might create where it isn't considered to be in the best interest of the nation to take the actions that align with the moral demands, because we've talked about Reverend Barber and how phenomenal his success has been, but it hasn't yet gotten that alignment with the geopolitical self-interest that we know that is what's really going to tip things.
Right. Right. So, when you write a book and you have all these ideas and stuff in it, the publisher says, okay, but you have to give people a to-do list at the end of the book. They'll go with you, but if you leave them hanging and don't give them instructions on what you think they should do, they're not going to leave the book happy. So the last chapter of the book is where I try to do some of that, to try to what are things we can do to manufacture conditions for national solidarity. And I have 5 things that I list. The first thing is we absolutely do need reform of our democratic institutions. We have to get rid of gerrymandering. We got to get dark money out of politics. We have to think about reforming, getting rid of these voter suppression laws, because what these things do is they rig the game so that no matter how the people vote, our votes are either suppressed or they're boxed in so that the results of the election aren't really representative of the will of the people. So we have to do some institutional reforms so that our voices are adequately represented and adhered to in our democracy. Okay, and some of that I think that was in the Congress and the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, tries to get at some of these institutional reforms. The second thing, more civic education, and this goes back to Gary's point. Civic education is central to creating a better country. And I'm not just talking about, do you know who your congressperson is, or do you know how many branches of government there are, with, the kind of things they teach in elementary and middle school, et cetera. I'm saying we don't do a good job of teaching people how to be lifelong citizens. We have to teach them how many branches of government they are. We have to teach them, how voting works, et cetera, et cetera. But once you graduate from high school, you're never, ever, ever required again to learn about how to participate in our democracy, to how to be a citizen. The Greeks had a word for this called paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A. And it is basically the education for life on civic virtue, how to be a productive citizen for as long as you live. And we don't do that here. So when I say we need civic education, I mean we need a lifelong course of learning that no matter what age you are, no matter where you live, you can access the tools you need to be a productive, informed, critically thinking citizen in our country in order to participate and make good decisions in our democracy. Number 3, a program of national service. Now, I'm biased because I did 21 years in the military, so I know what it's like to show up somewhere, not know anyone, but all work towards the same goal. And it's because of my time in the military that I worked alongside men and women from Iowa and Montana and Colorado, people I would have never met anywhere else in the world, except for the fact that we're in the military together. And when you work alongside folks together in service of a broader project, you begin to realize a few things. One, that most of you really want the same things out of the country. And you begin to see your stories, yourself, and other people who otherwise you would think you had nothing else in common. The other thing that happens is when you get to know people, you become more resilient to the stereotypical divisive appeals that people with power will make. And so if you've never met someone who's an immigrant from Mexico and you hear someone saying those people from Mexico are a bunch of drug dealing criminals, you are more susceptible to believe the stereotype because you have no firsthand evidence of anything to the contrary. What programs of national service do is it exposes you to people so that when others come along and begin spouting stereotypes about those people, you will say, actually, you can honestly say some of my best friends are in this group, and I know that not to be true. So that's one of the main benefits of national service, exposure to one another and also service to the country. Now, the question of whether it's incentivized or mandated, when it happens, those are all things to be figured out, but I am a firm believer that national service is a requirement to establish solidarity. Okay, so that's 3. The 4th one is deliberative democracy. Deliberative democracy through things like participatory budgeting, citizens' councils, et cetera. This is where people are required to participate in democracy. It could be at a town hall meeting, at a city council sort of convening, but it basically means that not only do people participate in these things, but the decisions that the people come to are binding on government. So for example, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, they set aside a portion of the city's budget every year, and citizens come together to determine how that money should be spent. And whatever they determine through debates, arguments, and then eventually voting and consensus, it is binding on the city council to spend that money that way. And it makes people part of the democratic process of governance. And in that process, they get to know their neighbors a little bit better. They get to understand shared priorities, places of conflict, but basically understand everyone's operating out of goodwill. And then it leads to democratic results that they can all see because the city has implemented the thing that they've asked for. And then the final thing is actually the one that's the most abstract, and I call it transformative leadership. We are still a nation that still has a bit of a hero culture. We not only want to hear what one's values or principles or beliefs are, we want to see them in practice. This is why when you come to Washington, D.C., you have all these monuments to Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln and King. It's because we like the embodiment of civic virtue so that we can look at a person and say, that's how it's supposed to be done. We don't want the values and principles to sort of exist in the ether and you have to, latch onto them as best you can. We want to see it in action. And so I do believe that in order for us to be led towards national solidarity, not only do we have to reform our institutions, not only do we have to educate people for civic virtue for life, not only do we need a program of national service, and not only do we need deliberative democracy that involves us in decision-making processes, but we also need good leaders. And not just a president or not just a once-in-a-generation figure like Martin Luther King, but we need leaders at the local levels and neighborhoods, communities, all the way through cities, counties, states, up to the federal government that model the kind of citizenry that we want to become. And so those are the 5 ways I think we can manufacture the conditions for national solidarity. And the thing that connects all of those together are that they force us to talk to people we wouldn't know otherwise. I call it making civic friends out of democratic strangers. And so we get to know our fellow Americans, and the more we get to know one another, the more we're willing to put our trust in each other and make our institutions better and create good leaders that can that make good decisions on our behalf. Because we are a democracy, but we're also a republic, which means we have to vest our decision-making power in representatives that we send forward.
Wow. That sounds wonderful. Actually, the league, like say the League of Women Voters is part of number 3, right?
Yes.
We're volunteers. We're volunteers with we have a purpose, united purpose. Marianne had a question, right? Marianne, did you? Yes. Unmute.
I always forget that. Thanks, Linda. I wanted to go back to your statement about our government, the United States government, is responsible for our current situation as opposed to the prejudice of individual people. And interestingly, I've been reading Paul Robeson and his book, Where I Stand. This incredible brainiac and actor, singer, everything really. And he said exactly this back in like 1930, that it's not about individual prejudice, that it's about the public decisions that are made. Our current Supreme Court, including the Chief Justice, seems to disagree with that. We are more segregated than we were in 1960. And housing segregation is at the center of almost every challenge that we have, whether it's segregation or every challenge that we have that indicates a lack of equity. So Black people have much less equity and money than white people do because of the United States government's housing policies over many, many years. And yet our Supreme Court still says that segregation is de facto. In other words, because I don't like you, or because I really like you and I want to live next to you because you look like me, as opposed to de jure, which is that this has been decades and centuries of decisions that have been made at, as you say, at the judicial level, at the legislative level, and at the executive level. We're in a situation now where we may lose our government. I think we're very close to a fascist country, and I think I love your 5 points, but I think one of the things that's happening is that people, excuse me, I need a glass of water, but I don't have one here. People with incredible amounts of money are paying for these groups of parents to go into school boards, to ban books. To some of them, churches are burning books. These are not coming from the grassroots up. These are coming from moneyed interests down. And I think we have to be very aware of that and very serious about addressing that. So I love the Poor People's Campaign. I think it's incredibly inspiring and effective. But I think we have to have something for the rich people as well. And I don't know exactly what I'm talking about, but if nothing else, transparency that says that this mother that's getting up in a rural or urban, let's say Maryland, school board meeting and calling for, and the CRT thing is so absurd, but calling for the banning of books or no talking about things that will make her child sad, that's not coming out of that mother. That's coming down to her in a very organized form today. I guess, and that's not much of a question, I guess, but it's very, very disturbing to me that somehow in media, this is presented as a grassroots movement. It's presented as organizing at the local level, as you were talking about in this deliberative democracy, right? Those truck drivers on the Canadian-US border, they didn't come there on their own. I mean, that's a financed activity, just as these school board activities are. And I wonder, Ted, if you could just, I mean, is there a way to be more transparent about this to the media and to the country at large? Because it is an aspect of fascism from my perspective.
Yeah. So
can I just throw one thing in? Just something quick, responding to Marianne. The thing that has to be turned around is Citizens United. That's what's feeding the money into people, to top groups, that's influencing our laws. But go ahead.
Yeah, so yeah, money in our politics is definitely distorting things for sure. So I mean, you made so many good points there. And so I think I just want to point out a few things. The first is, the first book by Ibram Kendi. Everyone is talking lots about the how to be anti-racist book, but the one before that, Stamped, that's the book where he basically,
from the beginning.
Exactly. He chronicles the history of racist ideas. And if the book were to be summed up in a sentence, the point it would make is this, that racist policies create racist ideas and not the other way around, which is to say, we didn't create slavery. The folks that enslaved people didn't do so because they hated Black people and wanted to punish them. They created slavery because they needed a free labor force in order for the production of these very labor-intensive crops to be profitable. They couldn't bring in a workforce that they had to pay because it was just the margins wouldn't have been there. But a labor force you don't have to pay, and a labor force that basically grows on its own through procreation, now it's very, very profitable for them to grow these kind of crops. But when you start enslaving people, it is not the natural condition for people to enslave one another. But in order to justify the activity, you have to make the people you're enslaving almost deserving of the institution. And the way you do that is begin to say, well, they're not as smart as us. You know that they're culturally inferior, intellectually inferior, biologically inferior. This is there were people in that generation who said this is the natural state of things, that Black people were born to be enslaved, and so we're not doing anything wrong. This is the way nature intended. And so it didn't happen the other way around, that they saw us as subhuman and then enslaved us. They enslaved us and then justified that enslavement by creating theories of our inferiority. What happens, though, is when the institution that created these racist ideas falls away, the ideas do not go with them. The ideas linger and become justification for other kinds of exploitation, like not allowing folks to vote, even though we had a civil war, we abolished slavery, we made formerly enslaved people citizens, and then we allowed formerly enslaved Black men to vote in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And within a decade, many of the states had stripped that right to vote away, even though we just fought a civil war over this and other questions. And it's because the racist ideas that slavery lent itself to lingered. And so this stays with us. And so how do we move forward? We have to if racist policy created racist ideas, then anti-racist policy eradicates racist ideas. And the only way we can do this is by convincing folks that it's in the nation's interest to implement public policy, public decisions, as Robeson calls it, that forces us to see one another as equals and treat one another as equals and undo the damage from centuries of disenfranchisement and oppression, so that in a generation or two or three, that equality, we now have allowed those racist ideas to die, and we've created conditions of where we can see one another as equals. So there's that. So to the point about the Supreme Court, and sort of moving it forward to, okay, how do we create this anti-racist policy? It behooves those who are happy with the status quo to make racism, as I mentioned earlier, an interpersonal issue. So when Chief Justice Roberts say the way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race, he's basically saying if people just stop being racist, then our systems will stop being racist. Well, the structural racism won't exist. But that's not how it works. It's actually the other way around. It's when you change the system, then the system creates the conditions that make racist ideas not palatable and not able to be perpetuated. And so it's the other way around. And so the reason that the policies like affirmative action, which was created by Nixon in the 70s, the Voting Rights Act signed by many Republicans in 65, they're now being undone because that side is looking at it as a fait accompli. We accomplished voting equality, we accomplished racial equality, so now we don't need all these laws and policies to enforce it. And that's exactly wrong, because when we look around at ourselves, we recognize that there are still people who discriminate on the basis of race. If you think the way to decrease the racial wealth gap by allowing more Black people to buy homes, where most Americans have their equity, if you think the way to do that is by educating every mortgage loan officer on how to be anti-racist, then you're going to be battling racism for decades. The better way to do it is to pass laws that say, if you implement practices that leave communities behind, that is not acceptable. And the government can step in and force you to remedy those practices so that you're not creating racial disparities. The irony of this all is that the Supreme Court has actually said that is okay. It's a legal concept called disparate impact. And this Supreme Court, well, maybe not with Coney Barrett and Kavanaugh on board, but the Supreme Court that was still conservative leaning maybe 4 or 5 years ago, found that disparate impact as a legal standard was constitutional. And what disparate impact says is, it's particularly in housing and in labor, if you have a housing practice or a labor practice that is as fair as you can make it in your estimation, but the outcome of that practice is that it exacerbates racial disparity in hiring or in who can live where, then that practice is not allowed because it has a disparate impact along racial lines on certain groups. This conservative Supreme Court said that is a constitutional standard. But when you apply disparate impact to things like wages, to university admissions, to these other questions, they say, oh, we've achieved racial equality there. That's all about meritocracy and hard work and personal behavior. That's not a structural issue. Then we get and run into problems. The reason I bring this up, and then I'll sort of wrap the point up, is that we still have a Supreme Court that recognizes bad policy exacerbates racial inequality. What they don't agree on is where that policy applies to. When it comes to building affordable housing, they say, yes, it applies. But when it comes to, can my kid get into Harvard, they say, no, Harvard shouldn't have the discretion to determine what kind of student body it wants to build. And when it comes to voting rights, they say, no, the federal government doesn't have the right to tell states with a history of racism that they have to ask for clearance before doing these things. So we've got some tendrils of good public policy to hold on to that are supported by even a conservative court's decisions. But to your point, those tendrils are fraying. And if we don't do everything we can to protect our democracy, we will lose it. And I think when I say lose democracy, I don't mean go full on fascism or authoritarianism. I mean, we'll go back to the 1950 versions of democracy. When the nation was founded, we had a democracy. We also enslaved people. We didn't let women vote. In 1860, we had a democracy. And we went to war over the issue of slavery. Native Americans weren't citizens. Immigrants couldn't become citizens. So we've had a democracy for as long as we've been a nation, and that democracy has been used to exclude people. And we may be on the verge of going back to a previous version of our democracy where exclusion was not only acceptable, but desired by a not insignificant number of Americans. And that's very, very scary.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ted. We're just about out of time, right? To end on time. I don't know if you have like a final thought or two for us, and then now we have like 4 minutes.
Yeah, I do very briefly. Look, I have talked lots about the problems we have, lots about some opportunities for success, but the book is, and I am just a hopeless optimist. I really believe we have what it takes to make our country better. Some of it is because when I think about my ancestors that were enslaved, the oldest one that I know of was named Kinsey Humphrey in Lamont, Florida. They never lost faith in the country. They had opportunities to leave. They had opportunities not to serve in the military, but they did. And they had the opportunity to give up on America during slavery, during Jim Crow, and they didn't. They fought, they named their children after presidents, they demanded that they be included as part of this project. So who am I to believe that we don't have what it takes to make the country better when the conditions that we experience today are not perfect, but they're much better because of the work of previous generations, the optimism of previous generations. So that keeps me hopeful that we can make it better. Also, because we're in this room together, we all want a better country. And so none of us are in the fight alone. We are in solidarity with one another. And the problem is that the solidarity in this room right now isn't getting the same kind of attention as the division that sells lots of ad space and gets lots of clicks on social media, et cetera, et cetera. So don't be dismayed by what gets the most attention publicly and in the media, and thinking that we are coming apart at the seams and Americans hate one another. There are more of us than there are of them out there, and we are quietly doing the work, but that work is what will change the country. I firmly believe that to be true. But I also believe this: it will not be easy, and there will be some ugly spots where our faith will be tested. But if this thing was easy, it would have been accomplished before we were born. And so now it's our turn to put in the work. And the goal is to leave the country stronger than the one we were born into. And if we can do that and pass that lesson on to the future generations, perhaps someday we'll have the America that King dreamed of. We'll have the more perfect union that Lincoln talked about, and we'll have the nation led by providence that Washington talked about. But it will be a journey, but it will be, I think, a beacon for humankind if we can figure this thing out.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. You are a beacon.
Linda, could you remind everybody that the books are available at North Shore, please?
Northshire, we had some books set aside at Northshire, so they're a discount for the league. So there's still books left there if you want to get one. And I highly recommend the book, even before I listen to Ted. So I guess that's it. Thank you again. Thank you so much for your time, which is precious commodity today. Time is, and we definitely appreciate that so much.
Thank you so much.
I'll say aloha to everybody. If you can tell, I'm not in the the 48 states. Anyway, I'm in the United States, but I'm not in one of the 48 states.
Very
So
good.
thank you again. All right. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Night.